So we're told that being a specialist is the best way to climb the professional ladder. But today I'm joined by banker, investor, Chief Transformation Officer, yoga teacher, and multipotentialite Tingting Peng, who shares with us her experience of being a generalist and how that's enabled her to build a career around her interests, her passions, and her skills. And that's got her to where she is today. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Tingting, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation, particularly because this is the first time I've been sat with a self-diagnosed multipotentialite. And actually, when we had this conversation last week, I had to go and Google what multipotentialite meant. So to start with, for the listeners' benefit, would you mind kind of explaining in your own terms, what is a multipotentialite?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept which I came across probably about 10 years ago now. Have you ever wondered why you may have lots of different interests that don't seem related to each other? I don't know. I mean, that was something that I questioned growing up, and in particular in my professional career. So in my self-diagnosis, in that process, it was really questioning the fact that I have lots of different interests. So, someone that has lots of different interests that may not be connected or seemingly connected, and someone who's able to kind of thrive in lots of different situations. There was a talk that I came across by Emily Wapnick, and the three characteristics that she talked about there, which I really resonated with, which was adaptability, rapid learning, and idea synthesis. And that comes from having lots of diverse interests, being willing to and highly engaged in lots of different sectors and industries. And maybe the one defining feature is this nagging question of, is this normal? Like, am I normal having lots of these different interests and not one idea of what I want to pursue for the rest of my life? Like, that might also be a sign.
Well, I love it. And I think it's a really interesting concept, right? And I think now that I've come to learn more about this, you can see it in individuals that I come close connection with on a daily basis, right? So, and for you, can you maybe give some examples of how this actually manifests in your kind of daily life?
Yeah, so if I take a snapshot of what a typical day could potentially look like, I work at a startup at the moment in a role titled Chief Transformation Officer. So, this morning I was working on pulling together some diligence materials for investors. So that's both quantitative, looking at numbers and analysis and running scenarios, and also qualitative, so trying to think about the potential responses to the investor questions. And then sometimes I'll also switch in the same day, looking at reviewing legal documents, trying to think about, from a company's perspective, what are the things that we're okay with, and negotiating terms on the legal documentation, and then spending parts of my day managing teams, so coaching or giving performance reviews or doing one-on-ones, checking in with people, and so it's a very broad range. Then if I kind of zoom out and look at in a given year what I might be doing, again, I could be raising money, I could be publishing an impact report, I could be managing stakeholders, I could be building teams. And then if I zoom out even further to my whole career, I've been, I'm a reformed investment banker, I've been a private equity investor, I've been a yoga teacher, and now I'm an entrepreneur. So it's, I think it really manifests in everything that I do, whether it's at work or whether it's, things I do outside of work.
It's very cool. That's what it is from my own perspective. So I'm keen to understand, how does one become a multipotentialite? How do you develop this set of skills?
I think the dots connect looking backwards. And I do think, you were wondering whether it's nurture or nature. I think some people may be born with the inclination and the curiosity of wanting to be able to explore and be good at lots of different things. And then through their life experiences, whether it's in schooling and academia, when you're told that, structured learning environments, you have to do a certain thing or behave in a certain way, and finding discomfort in that. And through that process, building self-awareness about what one might be interested in. So then in the professional setting, I mean, it happened to me when I was in finance, actually during the GFC when I got made redundant, and I was like, oh my God, this is the most liberating thing that could possibly have happened to me. Let me pursue another area of my interest. And I have come across and met with lots of different people who've had similar realizations at different stages of their lives. I think we're all oftentimes preconditioned, whether it's by our education system or it's by the way that our kind of traditional career paths are set up, or perceptions about traditional career paths being linear, that we don't stop to question.
Yeah.
But I think there are many of us that are, actually multi-potentialites at different stages of our lives, right? It's about being able to scan the horizon, focus and learn and go really deep, and then moving on to something that interests us in the future.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And so, are you familiar with skill stacking?
I think I understand what that is, but it'd be great to hear what that is.
So to me, skill stacking is where you learn one skill, you master it, and then you learn another skill, and all of a sudden the original skill becomes 10x more valuable, right? Because the next thing along is taking you further forward.
That's the term. Okay, yeah.
And would you say that multipotentialite is essentially an extreme version of skill stacking? So every time you learn something new in a new domain, is it technically making the previous learnings even more valuable?
Yeah, so I didn't know that there was a term for it. So consciously in my career path, that's exactly what I've been doing, right? So I started my career in financial services and banking. I had a very solid technical foundation. And then I went into investing roles. And then the role I took on after that, I consciously decided that because I had already mastered, so to speak, the technical foundations, I wanted to build upon my soft skills. So my business development, communication, stakeholder management skills. And I specifically sought out a completely new challenge for that purpose. And then, along the way, it's been, okay, so I've done this technical skill set. I've now done this soft skill, communications. What else might I be missing, or what are the gaps as I'm progressing into more senior leadership roles can make me a better individual and a better leader and a better kind of business executive, a better human being. So I had no idea that's what it's called. Thank you.
No, very good. Well, look, I think in answer to your original question, albeit rhetorical question, I think, it's definitely not abnormal, right? I think a lot of people would love to have a breadth of skills and capability. I think what is potentially abnormal is getting made redundant and being really pleased about it. So where does that come from? Is it kind of the opportunity to explore something new, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's the eternal optimist. I tend to want to see the world, as a glass half full. That there, actually, when I was trying to decide my path forward at that point, it was either to go back and do more of the same. So I was in the hedge fund world at that point, which I had an opportunity to do, or to pursue yoga, right? Teaching yoga, starting my own yoga business. And I asked myself the question, would I rather be definitely unhappy? And not that being a hedge fund analyst is a bad thing. Lots of people really love that. For me, it didn't feel fulfilling. And so for me, it would have been a path of unhappiness, definite unhappiness.
What was missing?
The sense of being able to tangibly contribute positively to the world. For me at the time, it lacked a sense of purpose. And I think I wanted to see more of the real world rather than being behind a Bloomberg terminal.
Right.
The alternative, which was going into teaching yoga at the time, to me, it was a blank canvas. So I had no idea what it was going to be like. I had no idea how I was going to make money. I had no idea. I was living in Hong Kong at the time. Right. But it felt like I'm in my control of my own destiny, and I could be potentially very happy. So what's the trade-off? Definitely or highly likely to be unhappy because I know exactly where that path leads.
Yeah.
Or the potential to be very happy because I can create my own future. That blank canvas, you can kind of paint the next version of your world.
Right, but surely there's no trade-off there, right? That's a simple one. I think you're probably underplaying it slightly. What were you letting go of to go down the yoga path?
Oh, I mean stability. I think I'm a mom of two now. So I do think about other than making decisions for myself, I do think about my family unit, my parents, like being in a caring position. I think I had the luxury at that time in my mid-20s of not, having any dependents. And so considerations will change, I think, throughout one's life. But yeah, you forego stability, certainty. Although, as I've now, in the last 10 years of my career, sometimes that's also overrated, because just because, you work at a larger institution, you may have spent many years building your career within the same company. Actually, when macro challenges happen and macro shocks happen, you never know, right? And so I think it is important. It's something that I continuously do in my career. It's always really important to think about, how do I contribute? How do I add value? What are the different ways I can contribute, not only to my current role and my current company, my current business, but like in the broader scheme of things. And so, not to be jarred if something like that were to ever happen again, which I know, during the last few years, it's been quite challenging in the tech ecosystem. And if your whole identity is tied up in being this one role within this one company, then I think that can be quite challenging for some people.
It creates significant risk, right? And again, coming back to the point around having this breadth of capabilities and skills, it de-risks you, certainly. But I'm assuming there are other benefits as well that you see in your kind of day-to-day life, being able to dip in and out of various different things. Can you maybe talk us through some of that? Obviously, you've given us an example of day-to-day, but is there a more specific example of where your kind of ability to zoom in and zoom out is helpful?
You're talking about benefits. I think the benefit to me personally is that it really fulfills me in a way that I think doing the same thing over and over again within a specialized area wouldn't. But in terms of how that might manifest, so to give you an example, I've spent the last 3 years working at a fast-growing startup, helping to raise capital, and because of, I guess, skill stacking, in my career, I've been a fundraiser for investment management firms. I've worked with institutional investors to deploy capital into private capital markets, so the GPs that then invest into portfolio companies, whether it's private credit or private equity or venture. And so in my day-to-day now, I think it's really interesting when I step back and I can zoom out and understand, when I go and raise money as an operator of a business at this particular stage, who are the people that I may be speaking to? What are their considerations? Who are they raising money from? What are their requirements? And therefore, how can I, in my current role, develop a strategy that speaks to the types of investors, the types of capital that kind of flows all the way down to be able to fund the growth of my business? And how can I, beyond the transactional nature of raising money, but how can I build the relationship longer term, so that as the business grows and evolves, that we're able to expand that relationship to do more things, and it creates a powerful flywheel, right? So
I bet, yeah.
Within venture, within private equity, successful exited founders then reinvest back in the ecosystem, where they may become investors themselves. And so I think that's one example that I can.
So having that baseline of skill and understanding enables you to think of things from the other perspective all the time.
Yeah, and I think within the business as well. So when I work with my fellow executives, peers, and also some of my direct reports in the past, I think it is being able to connect the dots to set the business context for the relevant audience. So I often think about whether I'm speaking to my immediate team or maybe a wider team, what are the things that they need to know? What are the business contexts or otherwise information, market information that they need to know in order for them to do their jobs well? And I can think about it from the financial perspective, from the operational perspective, from ESG impact perspective, from our investor stakeholder perspective, so that it sets them up for success, which then sets me and the business up for success. And similarly, if I was, liaising with our board, for example, what is the context that they need to understand? So I think it shows up daily in the form of being very thoughtful in communication, really understanding your audience, and then using the other tools in my toolkit then, whether it's data or influence, emotion, anything else to convey the message and persuade to get the outcomes.
It makes a lot of sense. And I guess most people are capable of doing this to an extent, right? But I assume it requires a lot of prep and a lot of deep thinking for most people. Do you find that you spend a lot of your time doing that kind of deep work, really starting to plan for how you're going to position it in somebody else's context?
I do, yeah. I'm a slow starter to then be able to quickly execute.
Right.
And slow in the sense it could be a couple of hours, it could be a couple of days, depending on the situation or the decision or kind of the strategic analysis that needs to be done. But as a principle, I do believe in slowing down at the beginning to really think about what are not just the immediate consequences, but the second and third order consequences. And it may not be immediately tangible to me, or it may not immediately impact me, but how would that impact other stakeholders internally and externally? And based on that, what is the simplest, most effective, most efficient, cost-effective solution to get us from path A to point A to point B?
Right.
So that's what I think about kind of to frame decision-making at the very beginning, and then actually that then speeds up accountability and decision-making further down the line because
you've got the clarity.
You've got the clarity, you understand the possible, and you won't be able to predict everything, but you kind of have a baseline of what could potentially happen, what are the risks, opportunities, and you can then respond much more quickly in the moment when you've already thought about it rather than reacting in that moment if it does end up.
I see this a lot actually, and sometimes it's quite hard to work with, right? So for me, if someone in my team is doing that deep thinking at the start of a process and taking their time to think through all of the possible outcomes, actually in that initial period, it can be a little bit frustrating because you just want to get going. Right?
Yes.
But then you see the benefits as you start to go through a process because actually you come up against potential roadblocks and it's already been thought through. But do you see there being a risk of paralysis for analysis?
I do, yeah. So the other motto or the other principle that I have is definitely bias for action. So as we're doing this analysis, what can we do to start progressing things? So is it identifying the resources and starting to kind of secure the resources? What other things that we could do at the same time to get the ball rolling? But I think that is the balance. So I'm actually very biased towards action. I want to get things done. But I want to get things done well. And I think it also is about recognizing when is the right time to be adopting this slow to start preparation approach. When it's a complex, ambiguous type of environment or problem, I would argue that's when I kind of knuckle down and I ask for the time and I explain why. But if it is straightforward, something that we've done before, limited in scope, right? Limited in impact, then you can kind of very quickly start to action. So yeah, it's not black or white, I think.
Of course, yeah. When you think about a traditional organizational structure, it's built around traditional career paths, right? Which means that most people, I guess, at a certain stage in their career are experts within a specific domain. So does that enable someone like you to do the deep thinking, but then also have a handoff into those experts so they can start doing the bias for action? Or do you find yourself going down into the detail as well to get things moving?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. So I work with our CFO, our Chief Legal Officer, our Chief People Officer on many cross-functional topics and kind of strategic decision-making across the business. And then I think it's also, there are times when, and we're a small organization, I think this may also translate into larger organizations where if everyone has their silos, then who's kind of filling in the gaps when a new idea or a new opportunity or new problem arises that doesn't fit nicely into a predetermined box? Then it's like, it's not my problem, it's not, I don't have the resources. So then do you sacrifice the opportunity for innovation, or do you sweep the problem under the rug and hope it goes away? Like, how do you handle that, right? I mean, I don't know how other companies do it, and it probably is, this shared accountability someone pitches in eventually, but to kind of systematize it and to make it very clear that there is a role like myself, like the role that I'm in, that's responsible for looking holistically at solving problems at scale so that we can continue to grow and innovate, and looking at areas of innovation so that we don't lose out on the competition and we don't stay static and be content with the status quo.
Do you find that you have to often say no to the things that aren't the meaty problems? Because I'm thinking that actually having that capability in an organization means that there's temptation for me, say as a CFO, for example, to come to you with a menial problem that maybe is enterprise-wide, that maybe I can't fix myself because I don't own the end-to-end. And the temptation is there to go, well, I've got somebody here who can deal with that for me, right?
Yeah,
but I guess
I'm still learning. Yeah, I can't say that I've got it all figured out.
Right.
And I'm someone who I'm a yes. Like, I like to say yes and embrace every opportunity, no matter how big or small. So I do have a problem kind of drawing boundaries, something else I'm learning.
Right.
Maybe the pitfalls of being interested in too many things. I think it is a matter of me setting kind of boundaries in terms of priorities that are aligned with company strategic objectives. And then being clear in terms of capacity, resource constraints, if any. But I like to be able to help, but at the same time, I also am very mindful about, at the same time as solving that problem for whoever my colleague might be, how do I build the organizational capacity to do that in a systematic way once I've done it once?
Right.
So is it, do I bring someone along who can shadow me? Is it putting into policy, establishing a process? Is it doing, knowledge sharing? So that I'm not continuously solving the same type of problem over and over again, because that's not scalable.
No, of course. I guess the other impact could be that if you look at an organizational structure, you've got those that are maybe underneath, right? So you've obviously got the top layer, the C-suite, but those underneath that are obviously trying to master their own craft. Does it sometimes impact their ability to execute on things themselves if someone like you is across the piece?
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, you can ask my colleagues, see what they say.
You're a strategic enabler.
Yeah, I mean, I always approach it with the business objectives in mind. How can I help you do your job better?
Right.
Is it more access to information? Is it additional context? Because oftentimes I find my colleagues who are working in a silo will lack at any given point in time critical aspects of that context, right? So I didn't realize that this was important for XYZ stakeholder, and with that context, they can then do their jobs more effectively or more quickly. So it's about connecting those dots. But yeah, I think it's relationships. So I think one of the other things that I've also really enjoyed is being able to understand what are my colleagues' priorities? What are they stressed about? What do they care about? How do they want to build their team? And not everyone is the same in terms of their leadership style. So again, how can I help them do their jobs better to amplify the impact that we can make together? But yeah, it's true. In a growing organization where there are lots of problems to be solved, we continuously have to be explicit about the things that are not explicit, right? So when we go into a project, I'm the one that says, okay, let's ask these questions, who's going to do what, ownership, and then I follow up and follow through so that they can then focus on their area. But unless we made it explicit and we drew explicit boundaries with resource dedication, clear resource allocation, timelines, and ownership, otherwise it's, you know this from consultancy and project management, it's how do we make people more effective.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's the name of the game, isn't it? And I think that's it's a challenge because you have to let people fail and try things out. And I think when you're capable of doing those things yourselves, it's quite hard to do that sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But still, actually quite rewarding because when you see them hit a roadblock and then overcome it and improve and learn as a result, it's It's always a good thing. People
Yeah.
moving forward.
I think one of the latest principles or mottos that I have adopted recently in the last couple of years since I started to manage different types of teams is my measure of success as a leader. If my team is not able to do things without me, I have failed as a leader.
Right.
If I have to step in every single time, I have failed as a leader. So with that framing and operating under that principle, how do I then, when I set tasks, when I set expectations, when I communicate, how do I enable them to actually learn themselves and create that scalability and that sustainability without getting into the details of the weeds.
And the principles that you're sharing here, how have you developed these principles over time?
I read a lot, so I borrow many of them. Emily Wapnick, that the TEDx talk that I talked about. There was a book by David Epstein called Range, and it's another argument for why generalists will thrive in a world of experts. Linda Grattan, who was my professor at London Business School, she wrote a book called 100-Year Life, and it's thinking about, as a working professional, if our longevity, improves and increases, we're going to be working longer, and hopefully in areas that we really care about and are passionate about. So how do we actually develop this skill sets? So again, speaking to breadth and range and people with lots of different interests at different stages of their lives. And then it just comes from, I guess, distilling the things that are intrinsic to me. So I care a lot about people. I think it's one of the reasons why I went into teaching yoga inadvertently. I care about making an impact in the world. And so how can I connect those pieces in terms of what is it that I hope to achieve as the legacy I leave behind? And what I want to teach my kids, what kind of person, what I want them to grow up to be, and how, what do I want to teach them to learn about interactions with people. It comes from lots of different sources of inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think lots of people have an overall objective and guiding kind of principles or values or things that they want to do. Sometimes find that quite difficult to connect to their operational capabilities. And having those clear principles in terms of things like bias to action really enables you to operate in a way that's going to help you achieve those goals, right? And I'm sure you've seen that over time, and clearly your career demonstrates that.
Yeah.
What is the downside to being a generalist?
People don't understand what you do. So, I've always had weird titles, weird and wonderful job titles, job descriptions.
Right. Looking for a job must be tough.
Well, so you know what? I've for the last 15 years, I've created opportunities and stepped into those roles. And so I think I've found a way to make that work for me. But I think the biggest challenge is sometimes at the surface level, people don't understand what I do. Once I explain it to them, the areas of focus that I have and the value that I bring, they immediately understand. I think the other challenge, which you touched upon through some of your earlier questions, is in a complex and dynamic organization, making clear internally what is it that I do and how is it that I contribute. So therefore, my areas of influence, my areas of accountability, my remit for decision making, so as not to hamper, organizational effectiveness.
Right.
That's another area. And then I would say the third is personally, there are times when I get burnt out because I'm context switching constantly, and a bit of a perfectionist because I want to be good at whatever it is I put my mind to and deliver the best outcomes. And so sometimes the other aspects of my life will suffer because I'm taking on too much.
So you talk about creating new roles. How do you go about doing that?
So I always start with trying to figure out, for that point in time in my life, what is it that I'm really passionate about? What is it that I want to learn, or what's the impact that I want to have? What new thing that I want to explore? And once I've kind of identified and framed that, then I research. So I look at my network. I'll give you an example. In Hong Kong, this was 2011, 2012. I decided that I really wanted to go into impact. I wanted to work at the intersection of social enterprise, government, and corporate, leveraging my kind of corporate experience. And I came across an organization, an educational think tank in Hong Kong, and they had a job posting for communications manager. I had no experience in communication. But I did my research. I looked at who I knew, warm introductions, and so I arranged those introductions. I then thought about what are the skill sets that I can uniquely bring to the table.
Right.
And then, despite not having, I think at the time they were looking for someone more of a journalism background. It was a lot of writing.
Of course.
I said, I don't have that background, but I love writing. I'm happy to send you writing samples. And so I actually did 3 different writing assessments as part of that process. And I can also, in addition to doing the core work, or solving the core problem that you're hiring for, I can also do business development. I can run programs for you. I can manage stakeholders. And so that's as one example from a while ago.
It's about putting yourself in the shoes of the hirer and then figuring out what are their needs.
Yeah,
and
how
then
can I solve?
yourself.
And to a certain extent, it's also what are the needs that they haven't even thought about?
Right.
Because I've done the research, or I've done the work to kind of piece together what is it that they do, what's their offering, where do they sit within the ecosystem, what are their growth ambitions, and what's the opportunity that I see that they may not even see that I can bring to the table.
Right.
So.
It's so interesting that, isn't it? Because everyone has a unique set of skills that they can bring into any role. But sometimes people forget to think about that, right? They're applying for the job that's in front of them rather than the problem that they're trying to solve or how they can solve it, right? It's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And so how do you manage that? Because clearly there's such a level of conflicting priorities on a daily and weekly basis, I assume, and you have different buckets of responsibility. How do you balance all of that in reality?
It's a continued practice.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's about trying to think through priorities, both professionally. So what are the business priorities for the year, the month, the week, the day?
Okay.
And then it's personal priorities. So that is my family, my immediate family, my extended family, my friends, the people that give me joy and refill my cup, and kind of keeping a very clear sight on both. And then finding time to rest. So when I'm sprinting at pace to get something done, always creating time to rest after that. And enabling my teams to do the same as well. So
you found that works for you, the sprint, then the break, rather than trying to do it all as an intertwined process?
It doesn't, I think over a sustained period of time, it doesn't work. It's like, life is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
And as a former marathon and triathlon runner, I know that. Like physically, I know that the amount of training that needs to go into sustaining that amount of effort.
Of course.
Working at a startup feels like running a marathon every single week, right? Like not every single.
Sprinting a marathon.
Sprinting a marathon, everything, or like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
That was the analogy when I did my undergrad at MIT. That's what everyone said. You're drinking from the fire hose because it's just all sorts of information coming at you at once. And how do you then parse through that information to synthesize the priorities that you then focus on? So I think being a generalist it's not that, I spread myself too thin. Actually, it is, I can adapt, I can parse through lots of information and then synthesize what is it that I need to focus on and then go deep.
Right.
Then come back up and then figure out the next thing, then go deep, execute, then come back up. That's probably a misconception of generalists, actually.
Of course.
The inability to go deep, right? So it's the rapid learning that enables us to go deep. I may not have long memory, but I can connect the dots in the future going forward.
But I think you've got to have courage to do it as well. You've got to back yourself, right? Because ultimately you are putting yourself into an unknown scenario, and that can lead to failure. So have you ever failed?
Okay, so I've made lots of mistakes, for sure. I think failure I would define as me setting out to do something to achieve a goal and not achieving it.
Right.
So I thought of two examples where I was shaken to my core because I really thought I had failed. So the very first one was when I was applying to universities as a high school senior, had my heart set on Stanford.
Right.
And I did not get in.
Oh no.
And I was devastated.
I can imagine.
I did everything, my applications, and I spent all this time, and I didn't get in. But I ended up getting into a few other really good schools and ultimately decided to go to MIT. And actually it worked out really well.
Well, of course. When you look back on that now, are there learnings that you think you took from that experience that you've applied into your later life?
I just remember that feeling of devastation, feeling like I really felt that I had failed.
Right.
I did everything that you're supposed to do. Right? Get the SAT scores and the perfect, GPA and all your letters of recommendation. I did all of that and the extracurriculars. And I know kids are under so much more pressure now when they're applying for university. I don't think I could get into MIT now, but I did what I was supposed to do and more. And I still didn't get what I wanted at that time. And so it was dealing with that feeling of just overwhelming, like I didn't want to get out of bed. I was like really? But ultimately it worked out. So that hindsight. And my second example of failing was a little bit more recent. This was about 7 years ago, and maybe 5 years ago, actually. I had decided I wanted to pivot into tech, potentially venture. And I found a company that I had my heart set on. I was like, this role sounds amazing. And I started, I went down the interview process. I got lots of intros and put my heart and soul into that process. And I didn't get it. And again, I had that same feeling where I was like, how could this happen? I did everything you're supposed to do and more.
And obviously that feeling was tough, but how do you think it's helped you kind of move forward from there?
Yeah. So I think in two ways. I do firmly believe that to be transformational leaders, we do have to connect to our emotions. And so I think knowing what that feeling of failure feels like, I think enables me to think ahead and plan ahead, so that, because I never want to feel that way again. I don't want other people to feel that way, right? So I think it's that was a very important lesson for me. And then secondly, it is about stepping back and looking at the level of preparation, the new network connections, information, market intelligence that I've now gathered as part of that research process and applying for that job, and looking at, okay, so now one door has closed, but so many others have opened because of this new wealth of information and network that I've created, and which one now is most relevant and most interesting for me. So yeah, there's always a silver lining when one door closes.
I think what's particularly fascinating about this conversation, when you kind of look at everything that you're doing nowadays holistically as a human being, you've been able to shape a life and a career around your interests and your passions, right? And we've touched on some of those today, but how much of that is you now planning ahead, would you say, versus being opportunistic and kind of, like you say, following your heart a little bit?
Yeah. So I always, I think, continue to check in with myself in terms of my values, my principles, my vision. Like, I want to make sure that everything, and what is it I do, right, in terms of actual work, I want to make sure that everything's aligned, because that's when I'm at my best. And I also consciously continue to skill stack. So as I'm thinking about the future, the areas that interest me are, how is AI going to shape our world going forward? So how can I learn more about that, and create opportunities to apply that in my current work, whether it's in my day job or some of the advisory roles I do. I'm passionate about climate. So can I leave behind a world that's better for my children, and what can I do, whether it's mobilizing capital, building networks, or working on specific problems, and how can I leverage and use my influence. So with these areas of interest, that then informs how I spend my spare time. So I I do some angel investing, and I advise companies and also VCs in terms of fundraising strategy kind of around these types of topics. I've also been working towards a board certification in climate, which is, again, given my network and given my current role, how can we amplify the conversations around company responsibilities towards climate goals and climate impacts.
So it's not just arbitrary, but meaningful.
Exactly. And utilizing, so it's a certification which then opens doors to actually be able to have more formal conversations with other people of influence within the ecosystem about the importance of actually making commitments towards climate. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about future-proofing, or how I can then continue to not only develop and build my skill set, which really speaks to the areas of interests, but also fulfills my purpose, which is how can I leave behind a world that's better than when I found it.
Cool. And so when you look back at your career now, what are the moments that you're most proud of, or the single thing that you're most proud of?
It's a really tough question. Yeah, I don't know if it's one thing. I think it is, looking back, being comfortable with challenging the status quo. I've had, it's not been easy being a person whose profile doesn't neatly fit into boxes. So, creating opportunities, identifying, creating opportunities, and not being afraid, I guess. Although I am afraid, but I'm not immobilized and paralyzed, and I continue to move forward. So I think that's probably the one thread that kind of runs through my career since leaving traditional financial services and leaving the institutional world.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I don't still get scared every now and then when I have crazy ideas, but it's that kind of willingness and the courage to keep going forward.
Resilience and grit.
Yeah.
And are there things that you'd change when you look back?
I don't think so. No, I don't believe in having regrets. So when I make decisions going forward, I think about that. Another book, The Power of Regret, by I think Tingting Peng. Yeah. I think about, what would I regret more? Would I regret not doing this, or would I regret doing that? I try and minimize regret. So I don't think I would change anything, because all those experiences accumulate to make me who I am today. So.
Very good. And so and the last question that we always ask guests on this podcast is, when you think about yourself at the start of your career, what lessons have you learned along the way that you wish you could share with yourself, maybe on the journey when you're just graduating?
I think I would probably, I'm quite an impatient person. It's something that I've tried to develop and cultivate over time. So this isn't, my bias for action, right? I'm very impatient, but actually I've seen the benefits of slowing down, which is why it's one of my principles now. Just have patience. I probably could have spent longer seeing things through in the past, rather than jumping to conclusions or jumping at excitement to the next thing. And so, but again, I think it's not that I have any regrets or would do things differently, but I think having that sense of patience to know that long-term impacts, it takes time. And then also to have a bit more patience with myself, right? Because I want to see results immediately, but
right.
Whether it's on the health and wellness side, if you're training for something, you're not going to see the results immediately. And so that's probably the number one thing, is to just have a bit more grace, a bit more patience, to know that everything's going to be fine, and to continue to, not self-doubt and move forward.
So slow down to speed up. Very good. Yeah. What a lovely note to end on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Luke. It's been a joy.
Cheers, Ting.